said, is Blue Book is alien territory. Warm welcome, Bill Perrine and Dave Hampton.
Thank you.
I listened to this interview that Bill did with it. I think it was the guy from the Music Book podcast.
Yeah, Mark Masters.
And he had you, or you willingly repeated this same phrase that I hear over and over again, and I've repeated it myself. But you said that thing about San Diego being a sleepy, boring Navy town.
Yeah. Did I say that? Okay.
Yeah, that's one of my notes.
Okay, good.
It's not. But.
Well, I mean, that was specifically in reference to that period, though. I will say that. I don't think it's any longer a sleepy...
Oh, no, I'm not interested now.
No, why would we be? But yeah, it was, absolutely. Or at least there was a perception of it that way. And I think the perception was largely correct, except for little pockets of interesting things happening.
Because really, this is kind of, there's almost nothing there. And then when the music department begins and Parch is here, then there's a kind of an onslaught. So that this decade that Bill focuses on is filled with a million different people doing really great things. But one thing that many of them do, like with the example of Musique Concrète, taped environmental sounds that are put together and worked into something, is our environment. This place, San Diego, the desert, the water, under the water. There's all of these great examples. The zoo, the birds in the zoo, right?
Yeah.
Is that David Dunn or?
Well, in Balboa Park, there was a...
Right,
yeah,
that's what I was thinking of.
There was sort of two schools of thought. Maybe they intersected sometimes. But there were people who were maybe... Like Oliveros, for instance, kind of managed to balance this divide between a sense of place and community and a sense of like psychic space, psychological space, personal space. There was a man at UCSD who set himself on fire in 1969, I don't know what that was, in protest of the Vietnam War. And it changed Oliveros' entire approach to music. She started thinking that she needed to approach music as healing force. And so she went back to basics, this, turning the knob. She got her accordion, she started playing long notes on the accordion. But she also wanted to develop this sense, a sense of community. She stepped away from electronic music because she said she preferred warm bodies to cold transistors or something like that. She wanted to connect with people. And so that brings it back to, I guess, the idea of being in San Diego, because she's connecting with the people around her, and she wants to make music communally while also looking inside. And then you have people like, for instance, David Dunn, who was involved heavily with Harry Parch. He was also involved with Paulina Oliveros and Kenneth Figueroa, who's a whole other ball of wax there. But David conceived of this idea of sort of environmental music. It was somewhat analogous to the land art movement at the time. The land art movement would go out to the desert with, with a tractor and create a divot in the earth, and that would be art, right? It was this idea of kind of working with the land as your material. And well, David had this idea of working with the land as your material, but music is non-destructive. You don't have to, you can sort of have a more, you can be on equal footing with nature, with music. You don't have to take a chunk out of the land, you don't have to rearrange it. And so he started doing things like going into Balboa Park and basically firing kind of weird synthesizer tones at birds, and having duets with birds. He went out to the Grand Canyon and did a similar thing where he brought a bunch of trumpet players, things like that, and they would play against the rocks. And at first the idea was just to hear what would happen playing in those cavernous environments, but instead the birds started reacting. And so he started incorporating further and further stuff with wildlife. He had a group called the YCMA, Young California Minimalist Artists. Is that it? I can't even remember now. Something like that. But it says something. They deliberately made it as a play on YMCA because they wanted people to make the mistake of thinking they were going to a YMCA when they were actually going to see minimalist music. But they would do things like they did a thing in downtown San Diego where they got these gigantic banks of speakers and they set them up on, I think it was Broadway, and blasted these tape loops through it. And it would do a similar thing to what happened in the Grand Canyon. The music would bounce off of the skyscrapers, the tall buildings, going up and down Broadway, much to the consternation of basically everybody. They made no friends that day. They did things in the local Golden Hill Food Co-op where they would put sort of ambient pre-recorded music in the cheese aisle. They would be hidden amongst the cheeses. And so people would walk through and they'd hear these weird sounds. And there are pictures of people, you know, looking through their cheddar or something while this little box is emitting sounds. And they would leave, again, getting back to this kind of egalitarian ethos that these people had, they would leave comment sheets where they would ask people to, you know, describe their experience with it. They also set up a thing where they left microphones out and they would give it to kids and let them play with synthesizers and like drop the mics and, you know, create feedback, whatever people wanted to do. So it was this attempt to get beyond maybe the insular tendencies of experimental music and the elitist tendencies of a place like UCSD, which was, David was not actually a student at UCSD, he sort of drifted in and out of it, but UCSD was this very cloistered environment, even more so than it is now. Like it was very much separate from the community. So the kind of stuff that people were doing,
Absolutely.
they didn't have a lot of chances necessarily to hear it outside of that. Did she make you do the thing? Oh, Warren Burke told me a story about taking a class with Pauline, this maybe was a little later, where you had to adjust the parameter on a knob for like half an hour at a time, and you were supposed to very minutely.
No,
you didn't have to do that?
No.
I think that's when she developed her kind of deep listening theories.
Yeah.
She would just have you adjust the parameters on this, some sort of tone generator, and you would do it as slowly as you could for, I forget what the allotment was, 20 minutes, half an hour, I don't know. And when you were done, you did it again. And when you were done, you did it again.
Yeah, well, she was very, much into Zen Buddhism.
Yeah.
So a lot of her stuff was Zen oriented.
It was very much about being, I think, in the moment and paying. I mean, there's a lesson in that, which is total simplicity. You're doing a very simple thing and making a very simple tone,
And
but you're listening to
slowing
it down. Yeah, exactly, and listening to every single little gradation as it happens. So anyway, once I figured out Oliveros was here and that she was here for 13 years, I realized that the more I looked into, I started thinking about her students. I thought, well, who were her students? And that's when I found Warren Burt, who has this great blog online where he has pictures of the early Moog studios, and he talks a bit about studying with Oliveros. And then these names just started popping up. Kenneth Gaburo, a name I'd heard but knew nothing about. I realized, of course, I knew Parch was here, but I didn't quite know the extent of what he'd been up to. And then it just goes on and on from there. I started discovering all these microtonalists who came after Harry Parch. A lot of them worked with Harry and then kind of developed their own thing after he died. And pretty soon you're out in the Grand Canyon with people playing trumpets to birds. It just goes on and on. It gets deeper and deeper and weirder. There's a fellow who just died about a week ago named Master Wilburn Burchett, who's in the book. And Wilburn was a mail-order psychic, among other things. But he created electronic music and sort of weird psychedelic folk music out in his studio, and I think it was in Lakeside. And he would issue these weird recordings. I think he did maybe 6 or 7 of them. That even though he was entirely self-taught and kind of full of shit, because he would sell these records along with these instructions for achieving transcendence, which were clearly just, it was there to get your $10 for the record or whatever it was. That's an outsider artist, I think you could argue, because he had no contact, as far as I know, with really anybody. He did some kind of folk music up in LA, but he essentially came down here isolated and did his stuff. They were a lot of outsiders, I would describe them as. Am I right?
One thing I'd like to bring in is that UCSD, I was really blown away that they were into improvisation.
Okay. Yeah.
And the music, their beginning music class for the the population of the university was an improvisation class.
Right,
The
right.
introduction to music
That's
through
right.
making music,
Right.
which is I was all about, because I started improvising with my dad back when I was in high school, and he was a San Diego Symphony string player and composer, but so I was already into improvisation at the time, and not only that, but I came to UCSD as Harry Parch's assistant when he was there for that short period of time. But it sort of got me into introduced me to all of these other realms that I really wasn't aware of, except for the improvisation.
Well, it kind of gets back, I guess, to that like leveling of hierarchies. The idea that everybody would get together and improvise, even students who weren't necessarily music majors, right?
Right.
So anybody could kind of do this. You could
Yeah,
be
really, real music of the people type of thing.
well, and that. I think that unites the whole, like, to get back to your insider outsider thing. That's where the distinctions start to erase, and where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
And it continues on later with Jonathan's magazine interval, where there are a lot of eccentric characters who came in with their own invented instruments, their own invented tunings, their own invented worlds. I wouldn't even know where to start with these people. But yet you manage to have a sense of community around people who are essentially outsiders.
Right.
Which is a really delicate, I think, balance to do. I can't imagine how
That's sort of my life.
yeah,
That's
exactly.
how.
There you go. And I think that was a particularly San Diego thing in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's exemplified in like what Jonathan was doing, but that was definitely, I think, the idea behind what Oliveros and Gaburo and all those people were doing. And that leads to people like Diamant de Galas, Jim French. These are all arguably, Diamant de Galas is arguably an outsider artist. She's, nothing sounds like Diamant de Galas, and she does her own thing. But she also was at UCSD off and on for almost a decade or something like that. So where these things meet is where it gets interesting, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good point to mention.
Oh, yeah.
Too.
I mean, there's stuff like there's
overlapping.
a great guy in town named Will Parsons who came out here from Iowa. He had worked with Parch, another Parch guy. Came out here around 79, kind of at the end of the book, but like he had a thing, and he's still into this, Will. We just saw him a couple weeks ago, and he immediately got out his guitars and tried to get everybody in the room to invent their own tunings. Literally, he was like, sing a note and make a tuning. And he put together things like Music for Citizens Band, which is a collection of like strategies for making your own band. Covers tuning, tunes, social structure, musical structures, mindsets. That's where you get into a lot of this more esoteric stuff. Space structure, language structures. It's a real uniting of kind of high and low culture and expertise. If you want to, you can read arcane scores, or you can read like an Oliveros instruction, which would be something like, think about your feet for 10 minutes or something like that, just to readjust your kind of awareness of your surroundings. It's really inspiring that people like Jonathan and Will are still doing this kind of stuff. I mean, they really haven't changed at all in that way. When I first met Jonathan, it was the same thing. Like, you go over to their house and they're still living the same way, and it's fantastic. So I don't know. That's it's an interesting collision of people and ideas, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't really happen. There are really only a few periods like that where these sort of worlds come together, and it's increasingly hard, I think, to do that these days. It's just a completely different environment, really, for doing something like that.
I mean, I guess this is kind of part of my question about wondering about the beginning and the end of, how you decided to focus on a decade or the end of the 60s and into the 70s is because what changes after the 70s?
Well, first of all, there are two things. The book really technically starts basically with the arrival of Harry Parch, which is late 60s. But as time goes on, things like the Center for Music Experiment gradually become somewhat more traditional. They're no longer doing exercises in ESP. Kenneth Gaburo is not doing mime pieces. He's not doing Beckett adaptations that somehow he got funding through the music department for. I don't know how that worked. And they start becoming a little bit more rigorous about the
computer-oriented.
There you go. So basically around 1979, almost on the dot of 1980,
Yeah.
I think it's something like New Year's 1980 or something, they got their first real computer.
Big craze.
And there's a photo, I believe, in the book of this computer, and it's a real computer. And it came largely at the impetus of Roger Reynolds, who's a remarkable composer, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, amongst other things. But Roger gradually, I think, steered the department in a somewhat more conventional direction, while still being very avant-garde. But he did some work up at Stanford where he was working with these computers, and when he came back down in around 1979, he was on sabbatical, I think, up at Stanford for a semester or something doing this work. He decided San Diego needed computers. And so essentially when that happened, the kind of Parch tradition, it really spells the end of that in a lot of ways. People from that generation, from the Parch world, from the Oliveros world, even when they were doing tape music or electronic music, they were doing it in a very kind of duct tape and wood splinter sort of way. It was very hands-on. It was involving imperfections, sometimes very deliberately. You know, Kenneth Gaburo had a thing where he would make himself stay up until he was exhausted, and then he would start playing on a synthesizer because it would disorient his senses. So by the time the computer starts coming in, it becomes increasingly technical. It becomes the kind of thing that becomes difficult for a layman or a non-trained person to do. It becomes increasingly rigid because you have to program the computers, and it's not like now where you can kind of do this instantly. You know, a lot of times they're working with punch cards and things like that, and it becomes a much more conventional music department. And luckily, by that time, in the early 80s, you start having punk rock and things like that start coming in. And while punk rock isn't experimental, particularly, and its, or at least the iteration around here wasn't very experimental musically, philosophically there was some of that. There was more of a DIY spirit that connects back to Parch and those people. And luckily by the time the university becomes a little more conventional, the community around it starts growing up a little bit. You start having venues, and you can catch a free jazz concert for the 5 people will be out, but at least it's happening. You can go to a punk rock club and see Boyd Rice and Robert Turman do weird tape music in a sort of black leather guise. I mean, working with similar materials that Oliveros was working with a decade before, but putting their own spin on it. And so the story moves into a whole other era, which is another topic entirely.
And the population grows and everything. We have a new question.
What other collaborations between the electronic and like Parch, more acoustic?
Well, Parch, by the time he was here, not so much.
Parch was not a collaborator.
And Parch was not a collaborator,
something
yeah.
like that.
For all his egalitarian ways and he was not he did, it was his way or the highway, I guess. Even though he would give people, I think, a lot of Jonathan can speak to this more than I could, but I think he gave people a lot of, he didn't give them freedom maybe with the music, but maybe freedom for interpretation a bit, or maybe just a sense of belonging to a community. I don't know. I mean, clearly he gave him that because people regard him as this father.
Well, his dream was to have this wonderful group of musicians that he would totally be one with, and of course that never happened. I think the main thing is his alcohol got in the way, and that but he was really quite rigid about doing everything his way.
And he hated electronics too. I forgot.
But he used a little bit of electronics in some of his later pieces, but he spoke about it. But
he was very disparaging about synthesizers and things like that. But I mean, to go to your question, there was a lot of collaboration amongst a lot of these people.
Right.
Not so much Parch. I mean, Parch worked with all these musicians like Jonathan or David Dunn, or there's really a long list of them, who would go on to do all these things. But there was a very collaborative spirit amongst, I'd say, the student body. There were a lot of things intersecting. And there were a lot of students who worked, again, with the professors, with their teachers, doing music. And then there were even visitors. Like, there's a really remarkable recording from '75. An Icelandic composer came out here, Thorkel Sigurðsson, I believe is his name. And he came out here for 6 weeks, and he was just totally disoriented the whole time because it was like the height of summer. He's in San Diego. He's by Black's Beach. He's on this sunny campus.
Everyone says, "Have a nice day."
Everyone says, "Have a nice day." It's this whole other culture. And he's, in a lot of ways, more of an orchestral composer, but he got access to the microcomputer and the synthesizer that they had at UCSD at the time, and he worked with Warren Bird, who was a student. And together they created these pieces called La Jolla Good Friday, which were recorded on Good Friday, which it's a really unique collaboration because it's two entirely different temperaments. And they're making this kind of computer/synthesizer music that's semi-improvised, semi-composed. And even though it's under Sigurðsson's name, it's really Warren Bird's record as much as it is theirs. So there was always, I think, that kind of spirit around there with a lot of those people, that kind of anything, you could collaborate with anybody, and you could collaborate with people outside of the department. Like Burrow was big on that, He would bring in people from the performing arts to work on his musical pieces, to work on his compositional linguistics pieces. And the environment was really conducive to that because there were all these really wonderful people doing interesting things around there. Eleanor Anton was here, Jerome Rothenberg, poet.
The art department and the music department did a lot of interchange.
Yeah, and it inspired some really interesting stuff, I think. Should we?
Well, yeah, but I did just want to point out, because you mentioned that one record, and I wanted to tell people, in case you're haven't seen the book or don't plan to see the book, that one of the really great things that Bill has done is included sort of little featurettes on particular records. And so it describes the album, it describes the context, and it's a wonderful device throughout the book that allows you to shift gears and sort of dig into a particular album, because each one is sort of, there's a whole history behind each of these recordings. And so it's a really wonderful device, and it helps sort of break up the book and allow you to get in, get out if you want.
And partly user-friendly and partly a way of sort of saying that these things are these representations, usually of a very specific place, time, or idea, and they really have their own stories behind them that sometimes don't fit into these. It's hard to make a grand narrative of something like this. Like, there's so much activity, and some of it so disparate, and yet somehow connected, that it's one way of kind of putting these things together. So there's a certain amount of flow, but also showing the interchanges between them.
And that's part of my last thought, is that the book is really heroic to tackle all of that kind of activity and put it all together and be able to, it's very easy and funny to read. Good book, Bill.
Well, thank you. I think we should shut up. If anybody does have any questions or anything, Dave's around and we'll be happy to answer them. And thank you.